Okay, guys. Well, it's my introduction. Okay, so typically when I do speeches like this, I don't really do notes, but because of the topic and what we're going to talk about, I could go off on tangents and talk for hours and hours. So we have a half hour to work with, and then there'll be some questions and answers afterwards. So I want to stay on topic and not go off too far, but I have some really cool stories to tell you, and then some more educational stuff. Talking about Pre-Columbian art, obviously, and how I got into the art market. But I will stick to my notes as much as possible, and then if you have questions, we can talk about those after the talk is done, discussion is done, okay? Welcome to the Heritage of the Americas Museum in El Cajon, California. Remember, this is going out to the World Wide Web. My name is Joy Martinez, and I am the Pre-Columbian gentleman. I'm a self-taught enthusiast. I say enthusiast instead of expert because I don't think any of us are truly an expert in anything, right? So I'm an enthusiast, and we can always keep learning. I specialize in Pre-Columbian art. I have an online Pre-Columbian art gallery, and also I have an online presence, social media, and we talk about educational stuff with Pre-Columbian art. I do videos talking about the sites down south, and then just general stuff about my ancestry, which is I'm Hispanic on both sides, Mexican American, and so to me it's not just something that's really cool, it's also very personal, and it's, I think a lot of us are trying to find our identity in the world, right? And especially people that are Hispanic, and so that's what's cool about doing the educational stuff, is that people can relate to it and also obviously learn from it. So I'm also a member of the board here at the Heritage of the Americas Museum, and as such, I would like to welcome you to the first annual Hispanic Heritage Month celebration. And Bob and I are already planning the next year's one, so we can always get better, right? So this should be a really exciting one. It's going to go on for the next 4 weekends, and actually all month long, and then it'll carry into October, which is Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. So that's going to be another celebration that we're having here at the museum. So today I'm going to talk about Pre-Columbian art and then how it exploded onto the art scene. I say exploded because that's kind of what happened. And these are some really cool stories. Some of them are stories that I've acquired through friends, through contacts, but also through personal interaction with people. So you'll be the first to hear them, so it's pretty exciting. And I find it really relevant because here at the Heritage of the Americas Museum, this is the largest Pre-Columbian art collection in all of San Diego County, in case you guys didn't know that. So to find anything more than this, you need to go to Los Angeles. Even the museums in Balboa Park don't have as an extensive collection as they do here, so I think that's really cool. And then obviously, like I mentioned before, this is going to be recorded and it'll be on my YouTube channel. So if you wanted to watch it later on, by tomorrow, it'll be posted to my YouTube channel, The Pre-Columbian Gentleman, obviously. Okay. So what is Pre-Columbian art? I mean, let's just start with the basics, right? Because a lot of people are like, well, what is Pre-Columbian art? Is that art from Colombia, right? You know, from the country down south? And it's a very common question, right? Pre-Columbian art. And it's really, that's not the case. Pre-Columbian basically means before Columbus. So it's an antiquated term that's still being used today. And in reality, when you break it down, right? I mean, Columbus didn't even discover America. We know the Vikings were here like 500 years before Columbus, right? But 1492 is the general term. Anything before that is considered pre-Columbian. And again, we know that the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, they were conquered after the 1492, but they are still considered pre-Columbian art. So, just 1 second here. All good? Okay. It's also, Pre-Columbian art also refers to art that's from Mesoamerica. And so basically Mexico, Central America, South America, although the borders were fluid, there were no borders back then, right? So a big part of the Southwestern United States would be considered Pre-Columbian art because it was part of those cultures that are Mesoamerican. And so Pre-Columbian art is divided up into 3 categories, okay? So you have the classic period, which is 380 to 980, and then you have the post-classic period, which is 980 to the conquest, again, 1521, give or take a few years, and then you have pre-classic, which is before the 380, and anything before that, okay? And so you have different cultures that are part of that. And I know kind of to a lot of people are like, this is a lot, but it'll make more sense, right? And so some of these cultures that were really early, for example, the Olmec culture, right? They came around 1200 BC to about 600 BC. That would be considered pre-classic. You have the Aztec culture that came around 1325 to 1521. They are considered post-classic. And then you had some cultures like the Maya that were in all three. So it really just depends on the culture, where they were. But those are the definitions of pre-Columbian art. Okay, but again, it's not really. I'm just setting the table to how pre-Columbian art got into the art market. But you first have to define it. Okay, so again, how did it get to the art market? Well, we had the earliest explorers going into Mesoamerica in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and so they were the first ones that actually encountered pre-Columbian art and brought it to the world, although it was mostly in small academic circles because it wasn't really widely presented to the people. You actually couldn't really see it in museums because it wasn't considered important enough, like the classical art such as Egyptian, Roman, Greek, right? Those are the big ones. And even to this day, pre-Columbian art still carries that stigma where it's not considered the true ancient classical art. And a lot of people still consider it, like a more of a primitive art or a folk art. Although if you look at the art, it kind of speaks for itself, right? Some of it's very sophisticated, very complex, and obviously very beautiful. Okay, so who were these original explorers? Well, one of them was the British explorer Alfred Maudsley. So he came in the late 1800s and explored all over Mexico. He was a photographer, so he took lots of pictures of the sites, and then obviously he collected a few pieces. You had Austrian explorer Teoberto Mahler, who was famous for being in Tikal. They actually named a palace after Teoberto Mahler. Again, he was Austrian. He came over with Maximilian to fight Mexico and decided, I like it here. So he decided to stay. He was Teobert Mahler then, but because he stayed, he changed it to the Teoberto, so to be like more, like he's gonna assimilate more into the culture. And he's again a famous early explorer. In the West Mexican region of Colima, Nayarit, and Jalisco, we had two early explorers, and they were the ones that first brought the art to light. The first one would be British artist Adela Breton. She came in 1892, and again, she brought the first West Mexican pieces, and there's some out here actually on display at the museum, to the art market and to basically to museums to kind of introduce it to the world. And then the next one would be the Norwegian explorer Carl Lumholtz. And again, same thing, they actually both purchased pieces back in the 1890s and then brought it out to the rest of the world. And so, but again, it wasn't really into the art market. It wasn't exploring like it did in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, like I'm gonna talk about. So there are some false narratives, okay, that you hear currently. So for people that, I think a lot of it has to do with the Hispanic cultures that are down south. When they talk about pre-Columbian art, they are basically, they get very defensive about it, and it's because they just don't have the information, okay? So there's a big misconception about how pre-Columbian art got into the art market by people that are south of us, that are in Mesoamerica, that are modern day Mexico, Central America, South America. And one of the false narratives is that the American or European colonizers came down, dug their grounds for months on end, and actually stole the pieces, and that didn't happen. And I'm going to talk about how it really happened. The other thing is that museums such as this institution, right, went down south, and same thing, they dug the pieces and stole them and took them all back, right? Again, it's just not the case, okay? So I'm going to talk about the truth, and this is how the pre-Columbian art got onto the art market, and it's a pretty cool story, I think. Okay, so the truth is that the modern descendants of the indigenous people that live in those areas, they are the ones that they knew the location of where these pieces were. They grew up with them. Sometimes they, as children, they even played with these, because it was just considered, pottery. It wasn't really important to them, right? And so they're the ones that found the pieces. Sometimes they would dig for the pieces, and then they would pass them on to middlemen. So it was Mexicans or Central Americans, South Americans finding the pieces, passing them on to middlemen or middle dealers, and then those dealers sold them into the art market to the American dealers, and that's how they ended up north of the Mexican-American border. Okay, so now the thing to remember too is that at this time when all this was happening, there were no laws or protections in place like there are now. So things are a lot different, obviously. So it was kind of like a free-for-all, basically, that anybody could go down there and purchase whatever they wanted, and that's what happened, basically. And so who created and influenced the market where it kind of exploded onto the art scene? Well, there's several people involved, and that's how I'm going to break it down to the influencers, right? The big people that made it what it is today. And it's interesting because it's all a big spider web. It's very, everyone's connected to everybody. And you'll see that when I talk about some of these people. And to me, I knew a lot of these people and I knew the stories, but when you do the research and you really dig into it, it's like really cool how like all this kind of happened. And it wasn't by circumstance. It was all kind of like related and really cool. Okay, so but the first person that was the most had the most influence on the pre-Columbian art market was an art dealer named Earl Stendhal, who owned Stendhal Galleries in Los Angeles. He started it in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And originally it was a gallery that was dealing with modernistic painters. For example, Picasso, Henry Moore, and then Matisse. You know, they were the first artists that were in this gallery. And at that time, it wasn't as popular as it is today, right? So these were relatively unknown people, and it was like it was a new art form on the scene, and a lot of people just really didn't get it, right? But Earl Stendhal, he got it, right? And so he became a very successful dealer because people started buying this art. By circumstance, he was exposed to pre-Columbian art, and so he talked to the person from Mexico who actually sent him 2 cases or shipments of pre-Columbian art, and people really reacted well to it. They're like, this is really cool. Stendhal thought it would be a really good complement to the modernistic painting because, you know, sometimes they're very abstract, especially the Picasso pieces, and so that pre-Columbian art as sculpture would complement these pieces very well, and that's exactly what happened. So Stendhal actually went back into Mexico, spent months in Mexico, finding the pieces, buying them from other middlemen, like we talked about earlier. And in fact, we all know the movie Indiana Jones, right? Raiders of the Lost Ark. So it's said that a lot of the scenes were inspired by Stendhal's interactions down south, whether it was you know, buying it legally, or I mean, it was all legal back then, but sometimes he had interactions with native people that weren't so friendly about selling the pieces. And so they say like a lot of the stories that you see in Raiders of the Lost Ark were based on Earl Stendhal, which is really kind of fascinating and really cool. The other thing that's interesting too is because of the location of his gallery. So Stendhal Gallery was located in Los Angeles, and in fact, it was his personal home in the Hollywood Hills that was a home/gallery. And guess who lives in the Hollywood Hills, right? The famous actors and stuff. And so Stendhal became the dealer to the Hollywood stars. And that was a pretty important thing because you'll see later on in some of the clients, and then again, it helped this explosion onto the art scene. Another very important person that dealt with Stendhal was a person by the name of Robert Woods Bliss. For those that don't know, he was a 1940s United States diplomat. And you may know the museum that he purchased and founded. It's called Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. So he purchased the area, built the museum, and the reason for that was to put his personal collection on display, which he bought from Earl Stendhal. So it's kind of like all tying in there. And these are some of those most incredible artifacts that you're going to see in the world, right? And that's part of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. So they're on display now. The whole collection is there. And again, it all came from Earl Stendhal. Okay, so we know Stendhal was a big player, right? And so who inspired Stendhal, or how did he get to the pre-Columbian art? Well, there were artists involved. And so we talked briefly on some of them, the international artists, right, such as Picasso, Matisse, Moore. And the reason why they inspired Stendhal is because they collected pre-Columbian art themselves, right? Because they found the abstract nature of the pre-Columbian art was very cool, and that it inspired them to want to not replicate it, but use it as inspiration in their paintings. And Stendhal saw this when he visited the painters, and so he took notice of the pre-Columbian art. You also have the Mexican painters. Okay, so those were the big ones, right? So who am I talking about? Well, Diego Rivera. He's one of the biggest Mexican painters at the time. He actually had a collection of 60,000 pieces in his personal collection. So 2,000 are on display at the Inequality Museum in Mexico City, and the other 58,000 are in a warehouse, unfortunately, but they're still there. And he also loved West Mexican pieces. That was his favorite. So the ones from Nayarit, Colima, Jalisco, and that was actually Earl Stendhal's favorite too. So that's how the spider web, these people interacting with each other. Frida Kahlo also, she was a big collector too, and she actually incorporated the pieces along with Diego Rivera into their paintings. So you can actually see pre-Columbian art in these paintings. And so it's got full circle, right? Because you have the Mexican painters, they're collecting, they're also painting about it, and then they're selling their paintings at the Stendhal Gallery to important people, wealthy people, the stars, right? The Hollywood celebrities. Rufino Tamayo was another one. He was another famous Mexican artist. He was from Oaxaca. He was a Zapotec Indian or a native, and he incorporated pre-Columbian art into his collection. And then Miguel Covarrubias, another Mexican painter, but also he was the first true archaeologist in Mexico. Even though he was an amateur, he did the first couple of digs in Taltico, which is north of Mexico City. So those are the painters, right? So that's part of the spider web. And again, what makes them so important is that these were people that in their circles, they were very important, and the pieces were getting out there and people were taking notice, right? But wow, these are really cool. Not only do you see them in the paintings, but then you see the pieces that these inner circles are talking about. So, but this is where it really took off, okay? And this, I call this the Hollywood connection. So there were some very early Hollywood stars that collected pre-Columbian art. And again, these were the people that collected the abstract art from Picasso, Moore, Matisse from Stendhal, and they gradually moved over into pre-Columbian art. So Edward G. Robinson, do you remember him? He was the gangster, like, yeah, smoking a cigar. At first I'm like, who is that? Like, oh yeah, okay, now I remember him as a child in the movies, right? Surprisingly enough, even though he played a gangster, and that was his role, right? He was actually stereotyped into that role. He was actually a huge art collector, and he collected Picassos and Matisses, and I mean, just an incredible collection. But then he became a huge pre-Columbian art collector. In fact, he actually bought the first 4 Frida Kahlo paintings. That was her first 4 sales, and he actually had it in his personal collection, which is kind of cool. Can you imagine back then having the intuition to think like, hey, this is going to be something really incredible, right? I mean, if we all could go back there, and he paid like a couple $100 for each painting. Like, wow, can you imagine? Like, they're all millions of dollars now. The next household name that you would know is Kirk Douglas, right? You remember the actor? So he was a huge pre-Columbian art collector, and in fact, I've owned several of his pieces, and that was really cool for me. Growing up, you seen him in the westerns with my grandfather. We'd be sitting down watching TV. To know that later on in my life, I would have a piece that was actually owned, or several pieces that were owned by him. It's really cool, right? The thing with Kirk Douglas is that he really got it out there in the mainstream because he lived in Beverly Hills, and he would always do these news articles in magazines. For example, Architectural Digest did 2 different stories on him, and you can see pictures of Kirk Douglas with his pre-Columbian art collection in the magazines, and so it's really cool. And what that does, it gets it out into the mainstream, and so people, they want to replicate what their stars are doing, right? Like, hey, this is cool, pre-Columbian art. Where do you find it? Well, Stendhal Gallery, right? And so that's how Stendhal became the preeminent dealer for pre-Columbian art. In fact, they transitioned from dealing with the paintings of the abstract painters to pre-Columbian art almost exclusively, and that's how he made the name for himself. Here are a couple other good names, big names. Gary Cooper, right? The singer, dancer, actor. Andy Williams, right? We all know, his songs, right? It's wonderful. What's this? Wonderful World or Wonderful. Now I'm blanking on that. So, but anyway, he has a couple of like household name songs, and then John Huston. He was a famous director that dealt with the westerns. One of my favorites though is Anthony Quinn. So do you know Anthony Quinn? So just so you guys know, he's actually a Mexican American. He wasn't Greek, because a lot of people think he was Greek. His name was Manuel Antonio Quinn, because he had an Irish father, even though he was born in Mexico, and his last name was Oaxaca. But he changed it to be a movie star, right? In fact, did you guys know that Rita Hayworth was also, she was Mexican, and she changed her name too. That was not her name. So that's what he did back then. But Anthony Quinn was actually a collector, and I owned one of his pieces, and this is where the personal stories come into play. When I was doing research on it, the piece was published in his personal autobiography, and I was doing his wife runs he passed away, obviously. His wife runs the foundation for him, and I actually contacted her and we spoke a little bit, and she mentioned to me that when he was in the 1950s, when he was filming movies, I think it was Viva Zapata, he would actually, when the filming was done for the day, he would go in search of, she called them treasures. He would go to the local marketplaces and the local stores and try and find pre-Columbian art, because back then there were no laws or anything, and you could just buy them in stores. And so he was quite proud of that. And so it's really kind of cool, right? So you imagine if you're going down south into Mexico, making these movies, and then buying pre-Columbian art, bring back as a souvenir, because it was, that's kind of what people did back then. But that's how he established his collection. So that's the Anthony Quinn. And I thought that was really cool. And she was very nice and generous. And you can imagine, obviously, he was a really cool person. So he didn't live too far from here. He was actually born in Chihuahua, but raised in East LA up here in Boyle Heights. So actually, I was born and raised myself. But okay, so the next one is Natalie Wood. Remember her, Natalie Wood? So she actually owned a very large collection of Chupiquaro pieces from Guanajuato. They're about 500 BC, very, very early. Before she passed away, she donated the collection to the Fowler Museum at UCLA, where it resides now. But again, she was a very big collector. And what do all these people have in common? They all bought their art from Earl Stendhal. So again, that's where the web comes into play. And so it's just really, really kind of cool, right? But the thing that Stendhal realized is that very early on is, for example, when you see a celebrity and she's wearing some sunglasses, you're like, hey, I want to buy those sunglasses, right? Really cool. Same thing with clothing and whatnot. So that was, early part of marketing. So he figured if I give these celebrities deals on this art, they'll get it out there into the mainstream. And that's exactly what happened, because these celebrities do, they do spreads in magazines where they, show the art collection, and then just the word gets out there, and that's exactly what happened. So that's how it literally exploded onto the art scene during the 30s, the 40s, and 50s. In fact, Stendhal had his first delivery in the 1930s. It was 1935, I believe, and just from that point on, Stendhal would actually travel extensively through Mexico and then collect the pieces and then strip them back in containers, and that's how he got the art onto the art scene. So that was really kind of cool and interesting. The next person that's part of this spider web is someone I'm sure we all know, Nelson Rockefeller. So yes, one day out of the blue, Stendhal in Stendhal Galleries got a phone call, and it was Nelson Rockefeller, who was a primitive arts collector, obviously very wealthy, and he wanted to buy some pre-Columbian art. So where did he go to? Well, he go to the preeminent art collector or art dealer in the entire world, which was at the time Stendhal Galleries. And so Nelson Rockefeller and him actually became really good friends. And so whenever Stendhal got some really amazing pieces, he would let Rockefeller know. Rockefeller would purchase them, and they kept it really kind of hush hush, because a lot of the wealthy people don't want people to know how they're spending their money. But what was really interesting with that is that Rockefeller built up an incredible collection, not only pre-Columbian art, but also tribal arts from Africa, oceanic arts, really from all over the place. And he approached the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Hey, would you guys like to do a display? I'll build a wing for you guys, and you guys can have all my art on there. And you know what the Met said? This is back in the 1950s. They said, no, thank you, we're good. They didn't consider that pre-Columbian art really an art form. It was more of like a folk art. It wasn't serious art. And so Rockefeller was kind of, he was like, that's not very nice of you, right? Especially since he actually donated a lot of money to the Met. And so what he did was he built his own museum called the Primitive Arts Museum in 1953, I believe it was, 54. And so where he housed his art collection of primitive arts, and that was included his pre-Columbian art collection. Again, sourced from Stendhal, so it's all kind of interrelated. Ironically, now that entire museum shut down, and you know where the pieces went? To the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So they eventually got the art, right? Yeah, it's kind of funny. Again, everything's just kind of full circle, right? So even though they denied him first, all of his art collection ended up at the Metropolitan. Okay, so okay, now this is where things really get. This is stuff that like almost no one knows about. Okay, but there's a Chinese connection in pre-Columbian art. So the Chinese connection is in the 1930s. Immigrants from China came to the West Mexican states of Colima, Nayarit, and Jalisco, and they bought up tons and tons of property. And the reason being is that they wanted to grow rice. And so they found that the fertile volcanic soil could grow tons of rice, and they could ship it back to China, and they could buy land cheap, and that was really important too. So these Chinese people, the last name was Chang, and they bought up tons of area, and so they started cultivating the soil, getting it ready, and guess what they found? They found tombs, and that's where the shaft tomb tradition from West Mexico came into play. And so these were the first people to really discover, the huge amounts of pottery figures that were available. And so they actually got them onto the art market because they sold them in local markets. Diego Rivera purchased from them, and guess who else? Stendhal purchased from them, and even some of the Hollywood celebrities. And so the reason I know this is because I've talked to some of the children, the grandchildren of these early, I guess call them landowners, collectors, dealers. But the way it worked was that, okay, the family name was Chang. Then they married into another name, Lei, so then you get Chang Lei. And then the Chang Lei people married into another family called the Mezas. And so the Mezas have one of the, they had one of the world's largest collections of pre-Columbian art from the West Mexican areas of Colima, Nayarit, and Jalisco. Now it's really early stuff from about 100 BC to about 200 AD. And so those pieces end up on the art market through those connections. Stendhal, through they actually dealt with Nelson Rockefeller directly. A lot of the Kirk Douglas, some of those movie stars, they eventually started buying directly from these people in West Mexico too. So again, it's just all kind of like interrelated and everything. But one of my favorite stories, though, and it's just so crazy, it's hard to even believe it. Okay, but Billy Pearson. So most like, who's Billy Pearson, right? So Billy Pearson was a horse jockey in the mid 1900s, like 1930s, 1940s, and he actually was involved in a serious horse racing accident. I think it was at Santa Anita, up north, and he was laid up. I mean, broken ribs, arms, legs, everything. His horse racing career was over. And when he was in the hospital, he was in traction, couldn't move, and so he just started studying and learning about art, and became fanatical about it. That was his thing, art. And so realizing he needed to do something, he thought, well, maybe I'll have a new hobby, new passion. So this is where it gets really kind of wild and crazy. But at that time, in the 1940s and 50s, they had these game shows. You guys remember the game shows that you could win a lot of money, right? You guess that question or answer the questions. And so there was the game show, circuit that was going on, where you could actually win a lot of money. He was a very intelligent person, and he actually won hundreds of thousands of dollars on running the game show circuit because he couldn't race the horses anymore. His career was over. And so, but back then, if you do the calculations, that's millions of dollars. What did he do with those millions of dollars? He bought art. He bought tons of artifacts, primitive art, but also pre-Columbian. That was his favorite, pre-Columbian artifacts. And so he would actually make trips down south, purchase the art, and then he became another dealer to the stars. In fact, Andy Williams was one of his top clients, I guess, or collectors' clients. But they was all kind of connected together. And what's really interesting is that John Huston, the director, right? He became friends with Billy Pearson, and they would go down south whenever he made a movie, and they would bring Billy Pearson down there, and they would go looking for artifacts and trying to buy stuff to bring it back. Billy Pearson, he passed away. Obviously, it's been a while. His two daughters are here, are still with us. I've actually spoken to both of them, and they're super nice. They both are really into art and everything. And there's the stories about their fathers, right? Just incredible stuff. And I was talking to one of his daughters, and I'm like, yeah. So I'm sure your dad has some crazy stories, right? I mean, Billy Pearson, right? Like, I mean, just imagine that it's like going from racing horses, being like, in fact, his wife was a beauty queen from Mexico City, right? I mean, he lived the life, right? And what his daughter said to me, he's like, yeah, my dad was he lived a great life. Let's just put it this way. He was 64 when I was born, It's like, just like, wow, and to a Mexican beauty queen from Mexico City, right? It's just too good to be true. But anyway, they carry on the tradition. They're both art collectors, and it was really nice being able to speak to them. And to me, I think that's what makes pre-Columbian art so cool, is that we're all kind of, the art form in itself is amazing, it's beautiful, but it's the people, that these stories, and the fact that you're all here, right? And it's a human connection to something that's tangible, but also there's intangible aspects to it, and I think that's what really makes it. And these stories are just so wonderful, and so that, again, another reason why I wanted to do this talk, just to get some of these stories out there, and then just put out there for people to read about. But yeah, that was the Billy Pearson connection. Another connection is. Have you heard of a liqueur called Kahlua liqueur, right? You mix it with coffee. I don't drink, but mix it with coffee, or even, I don't know, makes you drink it straight. Who knows? So back in the 1960s to 1980s, they had a campaign, and they would actually use pre-Columbian art. It makes sense because when you think of Kahlua liqueur, right, it has that Mexican feel to it, right? Or maybe that was just the marketing, because they marketed the pre-Columbian art with it, right? So for basically 20 years, they would have any kind of art, whether it was in magazines, newspaper articles, they would have pre-Columbian artifacts with the Kahlua liqueur bottles, and so they kind of made it like a household name. And the person that owned Kahlua liqueur was named Jules Berman, lived in Beverly Hills, pretty close to Hollywood Hills, right? Guess where he got his art from? Everything he saw in those articles, in those magazines, in those advertisements came from Earl Stanhope. And again, it's that whole full circle. It's just like a really tight spider web, right? It's just to me, it's kind of fascinating how it's just all kind of related, right? It didn't just kind of happen by chance. But I thought that was really fascinating. But it wasn't just celebrities, it wasn't just wealthy people. There's also everyday people that collected pre-Columbian art. And the reason being is that, again, before 1972, which was the UNESCO treaty, when they actually passed laws to protect the pieces, it was just everywhere. You can go down into Mexico and just find them in gift stores. I was at the Mengay Museum in Balboa Park a few years back. They had a pre-Columbian art exhibit, and I was talking with a gentleman who was, we were both admiring some pre-Columbian art from West Mexico, actually from Nayarit, and he was talking to me, and I'm like, yeah, it's a really cool piece. He's like, yeah. He's like, I have a couple of them just like that. I'm like, oh, really? I'm like, well, how'd you get them? He's like, well, back in the 60s, we went surfing down to Nayarit, because I'm really good surfing there, and we purchased a couple of figures that were on a little, like, they're driving down the road, and someone had a blanket laid out, and was just selling them for $10, on the spot, and they had a huge collection. But that's what it was like back then, because there were no protections. It's just the government didn't care. No one really cared. It was just, it was just kind of a matter of fact. Now you have to remember too that some of these pieces weren't just they weren't how would you say it? They weren't found on public lands, but they were on private lands. And so even to this day, in Mexican law, whatever you find on your private land is yours to keep. So people would find these on their property and they would sell them. So I thought that was really kind of interesting. Again, lack of enforcement and just people, just trying to make a living, right? The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of the pre-Columbian art coming onto the art market, because this was a really big deal, is that Guatemala. So there's a Guatemalan connection. That being because in 1972, Mexico passed a law they joined the UNESCO treaty to protect their patrimony, their cultural heritage, right? So that that made it really difficult for people like Stendhal and some other people to collect pre-Columbian art, right? However, in Guatemala, they still hadn't joined the UNESCO treaty. And for those that don't know, in Guatemala, there are huge, in fact, most of the area is all Maya. So that's where the Maya artifacts really took off, the cylinder vases, the plates, the really cool stuff, right? I mean, it's all wonderful and cool, but, for a lot of collectors, that's really what they specialize on. And the reason why Guatemala artifacts, took off, the Maya artifacts, is because in 1959, they had a thing called the Tikal project. And some of us that were here earlier were talking about Tikal, where they actually excavated the entire city of Tikal for about 10 years. It was the University of Penn working with Harvard. And again, 10 years, right? It was a huge, huge endeavor. And they actually made the city what it is today. And so they employed 200 to 300 Guatemalan natives, actually descendants of the actual Maya, and they dug the city up, excavated it, protected all the cultural heritage, right? And then they put the city back together. They reconstructed it. Now, once this was over, after 10 years, you have 200 to 300 people, Maya descendants, hardworking people that did all this work, and guess what? They're out of work. They're unemployed. They're like, well, what do we do for work, right? Also, during this time, there's a lot of political upheaval going on. It was the Guatemalan Civil War. So you had a lot of factors going on. You had Maya genocide from the government against these same Maya people, right? So what did these Maya people do? Well, they knew exactly where to find the good stuff, right? Because they've been doing that for 10 years during the Tikal project. And so you can you imagine like 300 people being able to go out and do their own digs and throughout all throughout Guatemala, and this is again before the protections. So Guatemala joined the UNESCO treaty in 1985. So again, you had that gap between 1972 and 1985, and so that's how all those pieces end up on the art market, is because you taught all these people where exactly to find them. For those that don't know, for example, they know that Maya royal burials typically happen underneath the pyramids and the very central axis. And so now you just taught all these people exactly where to go, and that's exactly what happened. So yeah, it's not really looting back then. I mean, some people want to say that, but if these areas aren't protected, there's no laws against it, then how can it be looting, right? So, but anyway, in 1985, Guatemala did join the UNESCO treaty, and so that protected the pieces that were there. And so that's kind of what happened. And so everything down south stopped coming up north, and then that's where the art market just kind of stabilized. And that explosion, it still happened because people were buying art that was actually here in the United States. But I don't know, I thought it was really interesting. And so, so basically where we're at today, in the art market, is that there are laws in place. The pieces are protected down there. I think there's a good balance, because you have pieces that are here in the United States that stay here. You have pieces that are in museums, government institutions here, and so they work well in harmony with what's down south. Because if you go to the museums down south, there is a ton of stuff that's there. I mean, it's overwhelming, right? They don't even have enough museums down south to display the pieces. Again, the Inequality Museum, which is Diego Rivera's museum, has 60,000 pieces in its collection. Out of those 60,000, only 2,000 are on display. So kind of tells you like they don't really have the the space to display them. So to wrap things up, so what do I love about pre-Columbian art? Well, first of all, it's part of my cultural heritage. I'm Mexican on both sides, and so I think the art's it's incredible, right? It's part of human history, right? So it's not just part of my ancestry, or it's everybody's ancestry, right? I mean, humans made this, right? I think it's expressive, it's raw, it's primitive, it's beautiful, it's fascinating, it's sophisticated. It's complex, and it's mysterious, and so it's all that, and it's just all. I mean, it's just I don't know. It's hard to describe sometimes, because I get emotional, because I think the art form is just so beautiful and so wonderful, and that's why I love sharing it and doing stuff like this. And also, what I think is the most important part is that each of the pieces has a story to tell, and that's my job as a storyteller, to tell the story for these pieces. And it's not just a story of like who made it, who owned it, and then how it got buried, but how it got into the art market too. And that's kind of what we talked about today, is that's part of the story, how it got onto the art market, how it got down from where it was originally found to someone's home today, to this museum, right, where we have pre-Columbian art. And so I think it's a really fascinating story, and to me, I think it's an important story, right? And now you guys have heard some of the cool things that like most people don't even know about. Well, they will know once I post this to my YouTube channel, but I think it's really cool. So anyway, so next week we're going to talk about the actual legalities that are in place right now regarding pre-Columbian art, because there have been laws that have been put into place, and so that's protected the art that's down there, and then also that deals with the art that's here in the United States. So, but that'll be the talk for next week if you guys are here. If not, you can go to YouTube and you can find it there as well too. So, but anyway, guys, that's my talk for today. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to entertain those for you as best as I can. Remember, I'm an enthusiast, not an expert. So, but I really enjoyed talking to you today. In fact, I was very delighted that when we first got here, me and my fiance, there was like nobody in this room, and we're like, okay, well, I guess I'll be talking to myself. You know, I'll fake it. I'm like, wow, what a crowd today, and I'm just myself. But it's really cool that so many of you guys, you know, took the time out today to be here, and then not only that, but that you found this an important topic to want to hear about. So thank you guys. So I'm gonna applaud you guys. So thank you guys so much. Thank you. You guys are all amazing. So appreciate it. But yeah, if you have any questions, yeah.
Well, as far as comment, my daughter and I were fortunate enough to go to Peru, and when we were in Cusco, it's almost an extension of the Museo Pre-Colombian from Lima.
Yeah.
But we went into the one in Cusco, and I think the thing that blew me away about mostly it was pottery, was how contemporary and how international this very old art form
Yeah.
was.
You're 100% right, and I think that's what the painters, that's what the Matisse and Picasso, that this is ancient art, right? That's thousands of years old, but it's contemporary. You could put it into a modern home, and it would fit right in, right, as a sculpture. And so to me, that's what's really fascinating. The other thing I find fascinating too is how abstract some of it is. Like how can they take the human form and make it, like what was the rationale and the reasoning? Because some of the pre-Columbian art, and you can see that out here, it doesn't look like the people. It represents people, but it doesn't look like people. Whereas but some of the other cultures such as Veracruz, Maya, they do look very realistic. But then you have different cultures such as the West Mexican cultures of Jalisco, Colima, Nayarit. Like right, that doesn't look like a person. It's really kind of wild and crazy, and it's thousands of years old, right? But it's just so interesting. Like what was we don't really know, and that we may never know, you know. But I think it's really cool, and it's part of the fascination. And even Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, they enjoyed that as well. You know, some of the earliest painters that were artists themselves, they saw the art value before anybody else did. So I thought that was really cool. Yeah.
Joey, afterwards, would you have the time to go out to our pre-Columbian collection and maybe take a few minutes to point out some interesting things about the collection?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Anybody that wants, yeah.
Speaking to that, where is most of this pre-Columbian art from in this collection?
Oh, it's really from all over. So there's a lot of Peruvian art. You have a lot of West Mexican art here, Maya art. So from West, Veracruz. So really from all over. So it's a really good collection in terms of it's very well balanced. So from all the areas.
Thank you.
That's what I was going to ask. Whether you know about the history of what we have.
Yeah, and again, it's for me, I think it's part of my obligation as a storyteller, right? Because each of the pieces has a story to tell. I think that's what's really important to me, and so I enjoy that aspect of it. And again, I'm not an expert; I'm an enthusiast, right? Because it's like because I think we all can keep learning. And anybody that says that, typically anybody that says they're an expert, they're really not, right? So it's kind of like I always like under promise, over deliver, right? So, anybody else have any questions or? Yeah. No, you're good. Oh, okay. Hey, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's something I love talking about. So, and typically, I don't use notes when I talk. When I do these kind of talks, or if you watch me on TikTok or YouTube, I wing it, just talk about it. But like my Mexican grandfather in front, that was, I came from. He can go on these tangents that you would not believe, and so we have limited time. And especially with a topic like this, I could just go on and on and on. But to me, I thought what was really relevant was the fact that the personal connections that no one gets to know about, that now people know about. Like for example, Billy Pearson's children, being able to talk to them and learning about the mesas, and most people are like, what? Chinese people were the first ones to actually discover these pieces, because they're selling rice. I mean, and then of course the Stendhal story is just so unbelievable, and some of his adventures, and it's just really fascinating to me how this stuff all kind of happened, but sometimes that's what history is, right? It's just certain things happening at certain times, and you have one visionary that could see the future, and that's really what it was. Because before that, Pre-Columbian art wasn't even. There were a few dealers in New York that had a couple pieces, but it wasn't like an explosion onto the art market that Stendhal created.
So it's Stendhal. How do you spell it?
Stendhal, Stndahl. Stendhal.
Would it be possible to bring a computer program with different forms of the art and talk about it in some?
Sure. Yeah. Eventually, we'll want to retrofit this room to be able to use a projector screen and do all kinds of stuff. So I think that's going to go over here once we get a curtain that comes down. And so eventually, down the road, I would love to do stuff like that. So I'm a board member, so I'm not going anywhere. So I'll be around for a while, and I would love to do follow-ups on this. But next week will be about the cultural laws that are in place, and then perhaps after that we could do something really cool like that.
Because I didn't know that they did paint, so it would be nice to see examples of different art forms
For sure.
that they put together.
Okay. All right. Is that it? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your afternoon. Appreciate it. Now you can enjoy the alpacas. So I didn't want to do mine at noon because I don't want to compete against those cute animals. So.
Well, you also have a cajon being played as well too. We have someone representing the House of Peru is sponsoring the cajon. The cajon is a
Thank you.